Hi, I'm James, the Exec Function Coach, and I'm here to share with you 5 ideas about ADHD that I think all parents should know. In the course of my work, I talk to parents about whether or not they should get their kid evaluated for ADHD, and these 5 ideas I think have been most helpful for me and for my work. And I'm going to be sharing with you both the ideas and some things that parents say to me all the time. So without further ado, here we go. The first idea is cognitive load. A lot of times when parents are considering whether they should get an evaluation for ADHD, they think, but I've seen him be able to focus. I know that if he just tries hard enough, he can do it. So it's really probably more likely that they're lazy. I hate to hear any kid be called lazy because the fact of the matter is most kids want to do right. And the fact of the matter is, kids with ADHD totally can focus. They can control their impulses if they're working really hard at it. And the idea of cognitive load is important because if your child is working really hard to control their impulses on a daily basis, if they're working really hard to just focus in on what it is that the teacher is saying, there's a limited capacity for how much the brain can be doing all at one time. I once had one kid explain it to me when he was able to stop blurting out in class and raise his hand and wait to be called on. The way he did it was by telling himself, don't talk, don't talk, don't talk, don't talk, don't talk, throughout the entire class. And you have to ask yourself, if that's what's happening, how much learning is that child actually experiencing within the classroom? Another thing that your child may experience is they're working so hard to meet the expectations of all their teachers throughout the class all day that when they get home, they've got nothing left. They have depleted their cognitive load. And so now they're running on fumes, and homework can be a really big battle. If that's an experience that you have on a daily basis, it very well could be that your kid is dealing with attentional difficulties and it's playing out in a way they're able to make it through their day just by trying really, really hard. And what you're seeing at the end of the day is a kid who has depleted all of the reserves. So that's the idea behind cognitive load. The second idea that's really helpful is the 30% rule. So oftentimes with ADHD, kids might have a hard time with executive functions such as prioritizing, organizing, planning, controlling their impulses, those kinds of things. And a lot of times parents will come back and they'll say, well, you know what, my kid, they're just young. They'll grow out of it. When they catch up with everybody else, then, it's not going to be a big deal anymore. And that's true. Developmentally, everybody develops at a different pace. The idea that mile markers, like kids should be doing this by this age, is not the best indicator of whether or not your kid is keeping up with everyone else. But the idea of the 30% rule, which I read from Dr. Russell Barkley, who's a great ADHD researcher, one of the things about it is that kids with ADHD are performing in executive function skills at a level that's about 30% of their same age peers. So another way of saying that is that if you take your kid's age and you multiply it by 0.7, that's kind of the age that they're actually functioning at. So a kid who is 10 years old might have the executive function skills of a 7-year-old. And that can, as the kid gets older, it puts them further and further behind their peers, and there are more and more expectations for the child to be independent, to be able to organize all the different homeworks for all the different classes that you see. And by the time it gets to middle school, it's really a pretty big deficit. And I share this with you because sometimes it's really important to understand that these differences and these deficits don't always go away. We might be able to see it at a young age, and the gap between them and their peers is really pretty close, But as they get older, it gets further and further away. And the fact of the matter is, the prefrontal cortex, which is right at the front of the brain, which is responsible for a lot of the executive functions, continues to develop until you're in your mid-20s. So the fact of the matter is, kids with ADHD, if they're not identified, will get further and further behind their peers in terms of executive function, all the way until they get to 24 years old. Then that development catches up. And that's a long time. That's a long time. That's a lot of school to be behind. And it can be kind of distressing for kids to look around and see, wow, everybody's able to plan and prioritize and organize their work. And here I am doing the best with what I've got. But for some reason, I have to work a lot harder at it than any of my peers. So if you notice that your child is having a hard time with executive function skills, yes, it may be developmental. It may catch up over time. Fingers crossed that's the case. But taking a wait and see approach is something that I would be cautious with. I'm of the philosophy I'd rather know than not know. So if you start to notice this executive function deficit, it might be worthwhile to rule out ADHD as one of the factors contributing to that executive function deficit. The third idea is basically, if you've met one kid with ADHD, you've met one kid with ADHD. That's right. Everybody experiences symptoms of ADHD a little bit differently. And so sometimes parents will say, my friend's kid has ADHD, and I know for a fact that my kid doesn't have ADHD because that is nothing like what my friend's kid looks like. The fact of the matter is there are two main types of ADHD. There's the inattentive presentation and there's the hyperactive presentation. And then you can also have the combined presentation, which is both hyperactive and inattentive. Hyperactive is what we think of when we think of ADHD. It's what that capital H stands for. Within a classroom, it's the kid who has a hard time sitting down. You know, they're always bouncing around, they're always moving, they are twirling pencils nonstop. They're the kinds of kids who seem to have an internal motor that is always driving. Kids with an inattentive presentation, however, aren't as visible within the classroom. They often daydream. They don't have a lot of physical markers, but they do require a lot of redirections. So they need to be reminded what it is that they're supposed to be doing right now. They need to be reminded where they should go next. They're usually pretty slow with transitions. These things are hard to spot within a classroom setting. And I imagine they can be really hard to spot in the home setting. So one thing that's really important for you to know is that some kids with ADHD are hyperactive. Other kids with ADHD are inattentive, and they look different. Another important idea is that boys and girls present ADHD symptoms differently. And it is possible for girls to have ADHD, even though they are much less likely to be diagnosed. So the thing I want you to understand about this idea is that don't assume just because your kid looks different from another kid who's identified as having ADHD, don't assume that because they look different, it's not the same thing, okay? The fourth idea is hyperfocus, and it's a fascinating idea. So a lot of times, parents will say to me, well, you know what? My kid can focus. Like if they're playing video games or if they're reading a book or if they're fishing, man, like you cannot get them to pull out of it because they are just so focused on that activity. So yeah, that's very true because kids with ADHD are able to access this phenomenon that's called hyperfocus. And it's really cool, but to understand hyperfocus, first we kind of have to take a step back. one of the things that's really helpful to think about ADHD in general is that it's not so much a deficit of attention, it's more of an abundance of attention. And there's so much attention, it's really hard to wrangle and control. So, for example, with distractions, our human brains are designed to pay attention to novel stimuli. The difference for people without ADHD and people with ADHD is that people without ADHD, when they notice a novel stimuli, they can bring their attention back to where it needs to be. Whereas kids with ADHD will notice a novel stimuli and then think about something else and then think about something else, and their attention just kind of goes on this beautiful tangent. I once had a kid describe it to me as having like too many balloons and you can't control which one drifts away. So hyperfocus is really an example of all that abundance of attention just being channeled into one singular thing. It's a lot like the concept of flow. I hope we've all had that experience. When you're working on something, you just get in the groove and you forget how much time is passing and you're being so productive and the world around you seems to disappear. That's what hyperfocus is. It's just a little bit easier for kids with ADHD to access, and it only really kicks in when they're doing something that they really care about, that they're really interested in. So if you notice that your kid can focus in on something that they really care about, that's not necessarily a sign that they don't have ADHD. That might be hyperfocus, which is actually an aspect of ADHD. Okay. And the last idea that is helpful for parents to know about ADHD is treatment options. Sometimes parents will say, well, you know what? I'm not interested in medicating my child, so what's the point in getting identified with ADHD? And it's a good question. And I think that all questions of medication should be directed towards a medical professional. But one of the things that's helpful for parents to know is that medication is not the only treatment option for ADHD. There are behavioral therapies, such as applied behavioral analysis or cognitive behavioral therapy that can be done by a psychologist. And there's medication. And those two routes, behavioral and medical, those are the routes that have a lot of evidence, scientific evidence showing that it works to reduce the symptoms of adults and kids with ADHD. So you have those options. If you're not interested in the medication, that's fine because there are other routes too. However, if there is a problem and ADHD is a medical issue, I believe it's always better to know. I like to use this analogy. If I'm worried that I have high cholesterol, but I'm not interested in pursuing medication because it didn't work for my family member, and they were able to manage it with diet and lifestyle changes. Well, I can go ahead and implement those diet and lifestyle changes. However, if I'm not diagnosed with high cholesterol, I cannot track my progress. I cannot look at where my numbers were at the start of my lifestyle changes and where my numbers were after my lifestyle changes. So I don't have a good sense of how well I'm managing my symptoms. If I do go into a doctor and I do get the cholesterol diagnosis and I know that that's something I need to work on, he can help me manage even those lifestyle changes. If I'm not looking for medication, I can still get help from a medical professional. And I would highly encourage you, if you suspect that your child has ADHD, look up a licensed professional to do an evaluation. And the more you know, the better you're able to address the symptoms. So long and the short of it is, if you suspect your child has ADHD, I would highly suggest you look into getting a formal evaluation, because if it's not ADHD, then you can treat the symptoms for what they are. But if it is ADHD, then you can utilize the help of licensed professionals in your area to really address the symptoms. And as with most medical things, the sooner you can address the symptoms, the better the long-term outcome is. So thank you for being here with me today. I really did appreciate being able to share these 5 ideas with you, and I look forward to talking with you next week. Have a good one.